Yes, ma'am. We'll be clear, and 233 will be clear on the N4.
I've been on the force for about 5 years, working the late shift in a quiet, mid-sized town in Ohio. Most of my calls involved noise complaints or the occasional minor disturbance, the sort of stuff that comes with a quiet town like ours. But one night, I answered a call that would stay with me forever. It was a little after midnight when dispatch radioed me about a disturbance at a house on the edge of town. A neighbor had reported hearing blood-curdling screams coming from inside the home. The house in question belonged to a single mother named Clara and her young daughter, Emily. I'd been to their house a couple of times before, mostly for routine welfare checks, and nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary. When I arrived, the house was dark, the porch light flickering weakly. A blue sedan sat in the driveway, its windows fogged up from the cool night air. I radioed for backup, but decided to investigate before they arrived, in case someone inside needed help. I knocked on the door and announced myself. "Police. Is everything okay?" No answer. I tried again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. A neighbor stepped out from their porch, clearly nervous. "I heard screaming," the man said, pointing at the house. It sounded like someone was in real trouble. With no response and the screaming fresh in my mind, I decided to check the perimeter. All the windows were locked, except for one in the back. It was open just enough for someone to crawl through. A chill ran down my spine as I shone my flashlight inside, illuminating the kitchen. Everything looked still, too still. I climbed through the window, landing softly on the tile floor. The house smelled stale, like it had been closed up for days. I called out again, my voice echoing through the quiet. "Clara? Emily? It's the police. Are you okay?" Still nothing. I moved through the first floor, flicking on lights as I went. The living room was untouched, toys scattered across the floor. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the table, the coffee inside long cold. But something was off. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The stairs to the second floor loomed ahead, and my stomach knotted as I ascended. I called out again, my voice wavering. As I reached the top, I noticed the hallway light was flickering, casting eerie shadows along the walls. There were 3 doors up there, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The first door opened to Clara's bedroom. The bed was unmade, and her phone lay on the nightstand, buzzing faintly with a notification. But there was no sign of her or Emily. The second door, the bathroom, was empty, but the mirror was fogged up as though someone had recently taken a hot shower. The sink dripped steadily, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. That left Emily's room. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to see the edge of her pink bedspread. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight sweeping the room. At first glance, it looked like a typical little girl's room. Stuffed animals lined the bed, colorful drawings covered the walls. But then I noticed something that made my heart race. The closet door was slightly ajar, and there were faint scuff marks on the floor leading to it. I moved closer, my hand instinctively resting on my holstered weapon. "Clara? Emily? Are you in there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I reached for the closet door, pausing for a moment to gather my courage. Then I yanked it open. Inside was Clara, her eyes wide with terror and a hand clamped over Emily's mouth. They were both trembling, their faces streaked with tears. Clara held a finger to her lips, silently pleading for me to stay quiet. "What happened?" I whispered, lowering my flashlight. She didn't answer, just pointed to the bed. I turned slowly, my flashlight casting a beam across the room. That's when I saw him. A man crouched under the bed, his face partially obscured by shadows. He was watching us, his eyes cold and predatory. "Come out with your hands up," I barked, drawing my weapon. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch. He just stared, his lips curling into a sinister smile. Before I could react, he lunged at me, a knife glinting in his hand. I fired a shot, the sound deafening in the small room. The man collapsed to the floor, groaning in pain as blood pooled around him. Backup arrived moments later, and the paramedics were called in to treat Clara and Emily. As it turned out, the man had been stalking Clara for weeks. He'd broken into the house earlier that evening, hiding in the shadows while she and Emily were unaware. When Clara finally noticed him, she screamed, grabbing Emily and running to the closet. The man survived his injuries and was later sentenced to life in prison. Clara and Emily moved away shortly after, unable to face the memories that haunted their home. To this day, I can't shake the image of his eyes staring at me from under the bed. It's a reminder that even in the quietest towns, darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places.
Yes, ma'am. We'll be clear and 233.
It was a cold December night when I got the call that would haunt me for years. I had just started my shift when dispatch informed me of a potential break-in at an old house on the outskirts of town. The caller was an elderly woman named Mrs. Graham, who lived alone. She'd reported hearing strange noises coming from her attic, like footsteps pacing back and forth. She's probably just hearing the wind, I thought, but I couldn't ignore the apprehension in her voice. As a police officer, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and something about this call felt different. I pulled up to Mrs. Graham's house, a weathered two-story home that seemed to sag under the weight of time. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the snow-covered lawn. I could see her peeking out through the curtains, her frail silhouette illuminated by the warm glow of the living room. She opened the door before I could knock, clutching a knitted shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Thank you for coming, officer," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know who else to call. "Tell me what's been happening," I said, stepping inside. "It started a few nights ago," she explained, leading me to the living room. I'd hear noises at night, scraping, tapping, like someone moving around up there. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then last night, she trailed off, her hands shaking. "What happened last night?" I prompted gently. "I heard humming," she whispered, a man's voice, low and steady, coming from the attic. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. They were all secure. There were no signs of forced entry, but the unease in the house was palpable. The air felt heavier, colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. "Do you want to wait outside while I take a look?" I offered. Mrs. Graham nodded, her relief evident as she bundled up and stepped onto the porch. I turned toward the staircase leading to the second floor, my flashlight in hand. The attic hatch was in the hallway ceiling, accessible by a pull-down ladder. As I approached, I heard it, a faint humming, low and rhythmic, just as Mrs. Graham had described. My heart quickened as I pulled the ladder down, the sound of the creaking hinges echoing through the quiet house. I climbed the ladder slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was cold, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. Boxes and old furniture were piled haphazardly, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "Police," I called out, my voice firm. "If someone's up here, make yourself known." The humming stopped. I froze, my flashlight sweeping across the room. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the faint creak of the wooden beams. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by an old wardrobe, was a man. He was crouched low, his back to me, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His hands were pressed flat against the wall, and his body swayed slightly, as if in a trance. "Sir, stand up and turn around slowly," I commanded, my hand hovering over my weapon. He didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight trained on him. "This is your last warning," I said, my voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in my chest. He turned. His face was pale, almost waxy, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Instead, the humming resumed, louder now, reverberating through the attic like a dissonant melody. "Get on the ground," I shouted, drawing my weapon. The man didn't comply. Instead, he began to crawl toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Panic surged through me as I took a step back, my flashlight flickering. Before I could react, he lunged. I fired a shot, the sound deafening in the confined space. The man collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I radioed for backup, my hands shaking as I kept my weapon trained on the still figure. But when I approached to check for a pulse, the man was gone. There was no blood, no sign of injury, just the empty space where he had been. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw his face reflected in the attic window, staring back at me with that same unblinking gaze. The backup officers searched the house and surrounding area but found no trace of him. Mrs. Graham was understandably shaken, and she moved in with her daughter the next day. The house was boarded up and eventually sold, but I never heard what became of it. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that attic. I've faced my share of dangerous situations on the job, but nothing has ever scared me like that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my patrol car late at night, I think I hear it again, that low, steady humming, echoing in the back of my mind. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to climb the ladder.
Yes, ma'am, we'll be clear, and 233.
I was partnered with Officer Greg Daniels, a veteran cop who'd been on the force for over 20 years. Everyone respected Greg. He was level-headed, skilled, and rarely rattled. So, when he asked me to accompany him on a routine patrol of Old Pine Road, I didn't think much of it. It was a desolate stretch of highway, winding through dense woods on the outskirts of town, and known for the occasional stranded motorist. But what happened that night turned it into something I'll never forget. It was a little past 11 p.m., and the road was blanketed in an eerie fog. The beams of our cruiser's headlights struggled to cut through the mist, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. The radio crackled with static, the usual chatter replaced by an uncomfortable silence. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" Greg asked, his hands steady on the wheel. I shook my head. "What kind of stories?" Greg hesitated. "Disappearances. People go missing out here. Cars abandoned on the side of the road, no trace of the driver. It's been happening for years." I laughed nervously, thinking he was trying to spook me. "You don't really believe that, do you?" He didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. We drove in silence for another mile before we saw it. A car parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly. The vehicle was a beat-up sedan, its doors closed and windows fogged over. Greg pulled over, the cruiser's tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Let's check it out," he said, grabbing his flashlight. As we approached the car, the fog seemed to thicken, muffling the sound of our footsteps. I shone my flashlight through the driver's side window. The interior was empty. No keys, no belongings, no sign of a driver. "Looks like they just walked off," Greg muttered, circling the vehicle. "But why leave the lights on?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the heavy silence. Before Greg could answer, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice broke through, a low, distorted whisper. "Help me." Greg and I exchanged a glance. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Can you repeat that last transmission?" Greg said into his radio. The reply was static, followed by another faint whisper. "Help me in the woods." The voice sounded close, too close to be coming from the radio tower. Greg motioned for me to follow as he moved toward the tree line. The fog was thicker here, the shadows deeper. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. "Hello?" Greg called out. "This is the police. If you need help, make yourself known." The only response was the sound of leaves rustling, as though something was moving just out of sight. We pushed deeper into the woods, the chill in the air seeping through my uniform. The fog seemed to close in around us, muting our footsteps and swallowing the distant glow of the cruiser's headlights. I checked my watch. It was almost midnight, but the forest felt timeless, as if we'd stepped into another world. Then we saw it. A figure stood ahead, partially obscured by the mist. It was tall and motionless, its back turned to us. "Sir or ma'am, are you all right?" Greg called out, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The figure didn't respond. Greg moved closer, his flashlight trained on the figure. "I'm going to need you to turn around," he said, his tone firm. Slowly, the figure turned. It was a man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. His clothes were torn and covered in dirt. and his mouth moved soundlessly, as though he were trying to speak. Then he pointed, his arm trembling, toward the darkness deeper in the woods. "What's out there?" Greg asked. The man's lips moved again, forming words we couldn't hear. But before we could approach him, he stepped backward into the fog and disappeared, his form dissolving into the mist like smoke. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Greg didn't answer. He was staring into the darkness where the man had pointed. Against my better judgment, we followed the direction the man had indicated. The forest grew darker, the air colder, and the fog thicker with every step. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving just beyond the beam. Twisted, shadowy forms that seemed to vanish when I turned to look. Then we found it. A clearing, bathed in an unnatural light that seemed to emanate from the fog itself. In the center was another car, its roof crushed and windows shattered. Inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was the man we had just seen in the woods. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "That's impossible," I stammered. Greg approached the car cautiously, his flashlight trembling. "It's him," he said, his voice hollow. "But he's been dead for hours." The radio on Greg's shoulder crackled again, and this time, the voice was louder, more insistent. "Help me, please." The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the woods. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the trees. The shadows seemed to move closer, their shapes more defined now. Figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, closing in around us. "Run!" Greg shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted back toward the road, the figures closing in behind us. The air was filled with whispers now, low and guttural. Their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. When we finally broke through the tree line and reached the cruiser, I glanced back. The figures were gone. The woods were silent. We radioed for backup, but by the time they arrived, the clearing was empty. The crushed car was gone, and there was no trace of the man we'd seen. The only evidence of our encounter was the lingering fog, thick and suffocating. Greg retired a few months later, and I transferred to another precinct. But I can't escape the memory of that night. The man in the woods, the impossible car, and the shadows that almost claimed us. Sometimes, when I drive past Old Pine Road, I see the fog creeping in, and I hear the faint whisper of a voice in the back of my mind. "Help me." Being a sheriff's deputy in a rural town means you get used to long, quiet nights. The roads are empty, the streets dark, and most of your calls involve loose livestock or the occasional argument over property lines. But that night, I got a call that broke the monotony in a way I'll never forget. It was just past 2 a.m. when dispatch called in about a car abandoned on County Road 7, a narrow stretch of pavement surrounded by thick forest. The report came from a trucker who'd seen the vehicle sitting on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking faintly in the distance. He didn't stop, said the whole scene gave him a bad feeling. I headed out, my patrol car's headlights slicing through the darkness. The fog was thick, curling along the road like ghostly tendrils, and the air had that eerie stillness that only comes late at night. When I reached the spot, the trucker's unease made sense. The car was an older model sedan, its paint chipped and its windows fogged up. The driver's side door hung open, and the faint sound of the hazards ticked steadily in the still air. I parked behind it and radioed my location, stepping out into the cool night. "Police," I called, shining my flashlight into the car. The interior was empty, but the back seat was littered with fast food wrappers and an old blanket. A faint metallic smell hung in the air, like rust or blood, but I couldn't pinpoint its source. As I walked around to check the trunk, something moved in the woods. A shadow, quick and fluid, just at the edge of my vision. I spun toward it, my flashlight cutting through the trees. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just the faint rustling of leaves. I moved closer to the tree line, my hand instinctively resting on my holstered weapon. The darkness between the trees was impenetrable, and every instinct told me to stay on the road. But then I saw it, something shiny glinting in the dirt a few feet into the woods. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the asphalt, my boots crunching softly on the undergrowth. The object was a set of keys, the kind that would start a car like the one sitting abandoned behind me. As I bent down to pick them up, a noise stopped me cold. It was faint at first, like a low hum, but it grew louder, becoming a guttural whisper. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. I straightened, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam illuminated a figure standing just beyond the trees. It was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, but its eyes glinted unnaturally in the light. "Come out where I can see you," I barked, my voice steadier than I felt. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its head tilting slightly, as if studying me. I stepped back toward the road, my flashlight trained on the figure. As I did, the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, and I reached for my radio. "This is Deputy Carter. I need backup on County Road 7. Possible suspect in the woods." The radio cut out, replaced by static and faint laughter. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its features were smooth, featureless, like a mannequin, but its eyes burned with an unnatural light. I bolted back to the car, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the road, and the figure now standing directly in front of me. It didn't move, but the whispers grew deafening, filling the car with their menacing chant. I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning on the gravel as I backed away. The figure didn't follow, just stood there, its head tilting again as if to say, "Go." I didn't stop driving until I was back at the station. When I told my supervisor what had happened, he gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "You were on County Road 7? He asked, his tone heavy with something I couldn't place. I nodded. "Yeah. Why?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. "You're not the first deputy to see something out there, and you won't be the last." I never went back to County Road 7, and as far as I know, the car was towed the next morning without incident. But every so often, I hear whispers in my dreams, low, guttural voices calling me back to the woods. I hope they never succeed. There's a stretch of highway just outside of town that most locals avoid at night. It's not the road itself that's the problem. It's the old motel that sits just off it. The Sunset Pines Motel was abandoned years ago after a string of unexplained deaths. Despite its closure, rumors persisted. Stories of shadowy figures seen in the windows and strange lights that flickered in the parking lot. I never gave the stories much thought until I was dispatched there one quiet night. It was a little after 11 p.m. when the call came in. A passing trucker reported seeing lights in one of the rooms, despite the building being boarded up. Thinking it was probably teenagers trespassing, I headed out to check. The highway was dark and deserted, and as I approached the motel, the air grew noticeably colder. The building loomed ahead, its faded sign creaking in the wind. The windows were dark, and the parking lot was overgrown with weeds. My headlights swept across the cracked pavement as I pulled in, illuminating the motel's crumbling facade. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I'm at the location. No sign of activity yet. I'll take a closer look," I said into my radio. I stepped out of the car, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wind whistled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and decay. As I approached the main entrance, I noticed something strange. The padlock on the front door was missing, the chain dangling loosely. Inside, the lobby was in ruins. Furniture lay overturned, and the wallpaper peeled away in long strips, exposing the damp plaster beneath. The floor creaked under my boots as I moved through the space, my flashlight beam bouncing off the dust-covered walls. "Police," I called out. "If anyone's here, make yourself known." At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like footsteps, but they were too slow, too deliberate. I followed the sound, my flashlight flickering as I moved down a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each door was numbered, the paint faded and chipped. Most were locked or stuck, but about halfway down the hall, one stood ajar. The tapping grew louder as I approached, and a chill ran down my spine. I pushed the door open, revealing a small, dark room. The bed was still made, the linens yellowed with age. A chair sat in the corner, facing the wall, and on the floor next to it was a pair of muddy footprints leading to the bathroom. "Anyone in here?" I called, stepping inside. The room was colder than the rest of the building, the air heavy and still. I checked the bathroom, empty, but as I turned to leave, the chair in the corner creaked, as if someone had just sat down. I swung my flashlight toward it, my heart pounding. The chair was empty. Before I could process what had happened, my radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice came through, low, distorted, and unfamiliar. "Room 13, it said. I froze. Room 13 was at the end of the hallway, just past where I was standing. The door to it was closed, the numbers barely visible on the peeling paint. Against my better judgment, I made my way toward it, my hand resting on my holstered weapon. The door was locked, but as I turned the handle, it swung open on its own. Inside, the room was identical to the others, except for one thing. On the bed sat a tape recorder, its red light blinking faintly in the darkness. I approached cautiously, pressing the play button. A voice filled the room, low and guttural, speaking words I didn't understand. The language was unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and my flashlight flickered again. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The door slammed shut behind me, and the voice on the tape recorder grew louder, overlapping with whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I grabbed the recorder and bolted, forcing the door open and running back toward the lobby. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic, until they were a deafening roar in my ears. When I finally burst outside, the air was still and quiet. The whispers stopped, and the tape recorder in my hand was silent. I threw it into the trunk of my car and drove back to the station, my hands shaking on the wheel. The next day, I returned with a team, but the motel was empty. Room 13 was locked again, and the tape recorder was gone. No one could explain what I'd heard or seen, and the official report listed the incident as inconclusive. I haven't been back to the Sunset Pines Motel since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice in my dreams, low and guttural, calling me back to room 13, and I'm terrified that one day I might answer. Being a police officer in a quiet town often means dealing with the mundane. Parking disputes, petty theft, and the occasional stray dog. But every so often, a call comes and that changes everything. That's what happened on a foggy November night, when I answered a 911 call from an address that didn't exist. It was a slow night at the station when the call came through. The dispatcher, Carla, looked puzzled as she transferred it to me. "It's weird," she said. "The caller isn't saying anything, but I can hear heavy breathing. The address they gave doesn't match anything in the system." I put on my headset. "This is Officer Monroe. Is someone there? Do you need help?" The line crackled with static, and then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Come help." "Ma'am or sir, I need you to tell me where you are," I said, my voice firm but calm. There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing and an occasional thud, like something knocking against wood. I asked Carla to trace the call, but she shook her head. "The number's not in service," she said. "It's like the call's coming from nowhere." Despite the lack of an address, protocol required me to investigate. The call had been routed to a tower near Old Ridge Road, a desolate stretch of countryside that had been abandoned years ago after a factory fire. Reluctantly, I grabbed my keys and headed out. The fog was thick as I drove down Old Ridge Road, the trees looming like shadows in the headlights. The air felt heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that made every sound seem amplified. I scanned the roadside for any sign of someone in distress, but all I saw were overgrown fields and the skeletal remains of the factory in the distance. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it, a house. It was an old two-story farmhouse, its paint faded and peeling. The windows were dark, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. There was no driveway, no mailbox, no sign that anyone had lived there in years. I parked the car and radioed my location. Dispatch, this is Officer Monroe. I'm at a possible location on Old Ridge Road. There's an abandoned house here. Going to investigate. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I approached the door. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, and the faint sound of wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. I knocked on the door, my voice firm. Police. Is anyone inside? No answer. The door wasn't locked, so I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was dark and cold, the floorboards warped and covered in dust. My flashlight illuminated a living room filled with old furniture draped in sheets, as if the house had been frozen in time. I called out again, my voice echoing through the empty space. If someone's here, I'm here to help. Please make yourself known. From somewhere upstairs, I heard a faint sound, a creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I froze, my heart racing. Hello? I called, moving toward the staircase. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, each step sounding closer than the last. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The upper hallway was narrow, lined with closed doors. The sound was coming from the last door on the right. I approached the door cautiously, my hand resting on my holstered weapon. I'm coming in, I said, my voice steady despite the knot of fear in my chest. I pushed the door open, revealing a small bedroom. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. In the center of the room was a rotary phone, its cord coiled tightly around the base. The phone rang. I stared at it, my mind racing. The sound was loud, jarring against the silence. Slowly, I picked it up, pressing the receiver to my ear. Hello? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The line crackled, and then I heard it. The same faint whisper from the 911 call. You shouldn't have come. A chill ran down my spine as the whisper turned into a low, guttural growl. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist. I dropped the phone, backing toward the door. Before I could leave, the door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. The room was plunged into darkness, my flashlight flickering weakly. The growling grew louder, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps pacing just outside the door. I grabbed the handle, yanking it open with all my strength. The hallway was empty, but the tapping followed me as I stumbled down the stairs and out of the house. When I reached my car, I radioed for backup, my voice shaking. A team arrived within minutes, but when we returned to the house, it was gone. The field where it had stood was empty, the ground undisturbed. My colleagues searched the area, but there was no sign of the house or the phone. The incident was written off as a mistake, a figment of my imagination fueled by exhaustion. But I know what I saw, what I heard. And every so often, when I'm alone at night, my phone rings. When I answer, there's no one there. Just the faint sound of breathing and the soft, rhythmic tapping of footsteps. It was one of those nights when the air felt too still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I was patrolling the edge of town, a stretch of rural backroads flanked by dense woods. The place always gave me an uneasy feeling, but it was part of my route, and I'd learned to ignore the creeping sense of dread. At around 1 a.m., dispatch called. A local couple had reported strange lights in the woods near their property. They couldn't tell if it was a vehicle or something else, but they were concerned enough to call it in. Probably just kids with flashlights, I thought, but I acknowledged the call and headed toward the location. By the time I arrived, the couple had gone back inside, their porch light casting a faint glow over the gravel driveway. I parked the cruiser and walked to the edge of the woods, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled. I called out, announcing myself. This is Officer Miller with the County Sheriff's Department. Is anyone out here? No response. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped deeper into the trees, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. After a few minutes, I saw it. A faint, pulsing light in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. It didn't look like a flashlight, more like the glow of a lantern or fire. I radioed dispatch, letting them know what I'd found, and proceeded cautiously. The light led me to a small clearing, where I found something I couldn't explain. In the center of the clearing was an old, rusted pickup truck, its headlights flickering faintly despite the fact that the engine wasn't running. The windows were fogged up, and the air around the truck felt unnaturally cold. I circled the vehicle, shining my flashlight inside. The cab was empty, but the seats were torn and covered in what looked like dried mud, or something darker. I tried the door, but it was locked. As I reached for my radio to call for a tow, the lights cut out, plunging the clearing into darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees, followed by a low, guttural growl. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam landed on a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its body shrouded in shadows, its head tilted as if studying me, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light from my flashlight. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is the police. Identify yourself." The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its glowing eyes locked on me. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I radioed for backup, my heart racing. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I've got a possible suspect in the woods near my location, requesting immediate assistance." "Copy that," came the reply. "Backup is on the way." The rustling in the trees grew louder, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. It wasn't just one person out there. There were multiple figures moving through the woods, their shapes barely visible in the shadows. The air grew colder, and the growling returned, this time closer. I retreated toward the truck, my flashlight darting from tree to tree. The figures stayed just out of reach, their movements deliberate and predatory. When I reached the truck, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A strange symbol etched into the hood, jagged and crude. It looked ancient, like something you'd see in an old book about witchcraft or rituals. The growling intensified, and I knew I couldn't stay in the clearing. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the trees. The figures didn't follow, but their presence was palpable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. By the time backup arrived, the clearing was empty. The truck was gone, and the strange symbol I'd seen was nowhere to be found. My colleagues searched the area but found no trace of the figures or the lights. I filed my report, but the official explanation was vague. Probably teenagers playing a prank or a case of misidentification. But I knew better. Whatever I'd encountered in those woods wasn't human, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to see again. Weeks later, I drove past the area during the day. The clearing was still there, but the air felt wrong, heavy with an unspoken threat. As I passed, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing among the trees, watching. I didn't stop, and I haven't patrolled that stretch of road since. It was a quiet Tuesday night when the call came in. The dispatcher informed me that a woman named Patricia had dialed 911, whispering that someone was inside her house. Before she could provide her address, the line went dead. The call was traced to a small, secluded neighborhood near Crestwood Drive, an area known for its large yards and wooded surroundings. I was only a few blocks away, so I arrived within minutes. The house was modest, a single-story ranch-style home set back from the road. The porch light was on, casting an eerie glow over the neatly trimmed lawn. As I pulled up, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. I stepped out of my cruiser, radioed dispatch, and approached the house cautiously. "Police," I called out. "If anyone's inside, make yourself known." The house was silent. I pushed the door open wider, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was empty, the furniture neatly arranged, nothing out of place. But something felt off. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that made every creak of the floorboard sound deafening. "Patricia?" I called out, my voice echoing through the house. No response. I moved through the house methodically, clearing each room. The kitchen was spotless, the dining room untouched. But when I reached the hallway leading to the bedrooms, I noticed something strange. muddy footprints leading from the back door to one of the bedrooms. The footprints were small, almost childlike, and they seemed to end at the door. I called out again, but the silence persisted. Slowly, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The bedroom was empty, the bed neatly made, but on the floor was a landline phone, its cord yanked from the wall. The footprints led to the closet. I raised my gun, my flashlight trained on the closet door. "Police, come out with your hands up." There was no response, but I could hear faint breathing from inside. I repeated the command, but the breathing only grew quieter. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, yanking the door open. Inside was a mannequin, its face blank and featureless. It was wearing a dress, its hands positioned as if holding an invisible object. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. Then I noticed the footprints led away from the closet to the adjoining bathroom. The bathroom door was ajar, steam seeping out as if someone had just taken a shower. My flashlight illuminated the tiled floor, which was wet and slippery. I could see my reflection in the fogged-up mirror, but something was wrong. Behind me, in the reflection, was a figure. I spun around, my gun drawn, but the room was empty. The only sound was the dripping of water from the faucet. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there. Standing behind me, its face obscured by shadow. I backed out of the bathroom, my heart racing. I radioed for backup, but the line crackled with static. The lights in the house flickered, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footprints were gone, but the air felt colder. Then, from the bedroom I just cleared, came a voice. "Why are you here?" The voice was low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. I turned toward the room, but it was empty. The closet door was open again, the mannequin now facing the doorway. I didn't wait for backup. I ran out of the house, slamming the front door behind me. When my partner arrived 10 minutes later, I was sitting in my cruiser, shaking. We searched the house together, but there was no sign of anyone. The mannequin was gone, and the footprints had disappeared. Even the phone in the bedroom was back on the nightstand, its cord neatly coiled. The official report listed the incident as inconclusive. Patricia was never found, and her family reported her missing the next day. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house, but I'll never forget the figure in the mirror. Sometimes, when I'm driving past Crestwood Drive, I feel like I'm being watched, and I wonder if Patricia ever left, or if something else kept her there. It was late September when the call came in. A routine disturbance at an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The caller, a man named Darren, claimed he had witnessed a violent altercation in one of the units. He sounded frantic, insisting he had seen someone being dragged into an apartment and pleading for the police to hurry. The address was a building I knew well, the Marwood Arms. It had a reputation. The place was a haven for squatters and drug deals, with its dilapidated exterior and flickering neon sign that read Marwood, but always seemed to lose the M. Most of the time, calls to Marwood Arms were wild goose chases, but something in Darren's voice made me take this one seriously. I arrived at the scene a little after 10 p.m., parking under the flickering streetlight that barely illuminated the cracked pavement of the lot. The building was a monolith of decay, its windows dark except for the faint glow of a TV in one unit. I radioed dispatch to confirm my arrival, then headed toward apartment 3C, where Darren had said the altercation occurred. The hallway was just as I remembered, narrow, with peeling wallpaper and a smell that was equal parts mildew and stale cigarettes. Darren was waiting at the door to his unit, 3A, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Officer, thank God you're here," he said, barely able to meet my eyes. "I saw it, I swear. He was dragging her, and she was screaming. You have to do something." I tried to calm him down, asking for details. Darren described a man he'd seen through his peephole, pulling a struggling woman into 3C. He said the man was large, with dark clothes and a hood that obscured his face. The woman, he claimed, had been kicking and yelling, but the noise stopped suddenly. "Did you see him leave the apartment?" I asked. Darren shook his head. "No, the door hasn't opened since." I knocked on the door of 3C, announcing myself. "Police, open the door." There was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. The silence from inside was unnerving. I turned back to Darren. "Are you sure this is the right unit?" He nodded fervently. "I'm sure. I saw them go in." I radioed for backup, but decided to investigate further while I waited. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty living room. My flashlight swept across the space, illuminating a shabby couch, a coffee table covered in empty bottles, and a single chair facing a small, flickering TV. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic, something that made my stomach turn. I called out, "This is the police. If anyone's here, make yourself known." Nothing. I moved cautiously through the apartment, clearing each room. The bedroom was empty, the bed unmade and covered in dirty clothes. The kitchen was a mess of dishes and rotting food, but the bathroom door was closed. I knocked, my heart pounding. "Police, open the door." No answer. I turned the handle, pushing the door open slowly. The bathroom was small, with a cracked mirror and a yellow tub. At first, it seemed empty, but then I saw it. A smear of blood on the floor, leading to the shower curtain. My flashlight beam wavered as I approached. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it back, my breath catching in my throat. The tub was empty, but the blood smear led to the drain, where more blood pooled around the edges. I leaned in closer, noticing long, dark strands of hair tangled in the grate. My stomach churned as I backed away. I returned to the living room, where Darren was now standing in the doorway, his face pale. "Did you find her?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice tight. "But there's blood in the bathroom. Stay here while I—" Before I could finish, the door to the apartment slammed shut, the sound echoing through the hallway. Darren jumped, his back pressed against the wall. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. "What's going on?" Darren whispered, his eyes darting around the room. The TV flickered, the static growing louder. The screen glitched, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A dark figure standing in the background of the image. But when I blinked, it was gone. The air grew colder, and the lights began to flicker. A low, guttural sound filled the room, like distant whispers overlapping in a chaotic hum. Darren backed into the corner, his hands over his ears. "Make it stop," he cried. I reached for my radio, but it was dead, just static. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I drew my weapon, scanning the shadows as the whispers grew louder. Then, from the corner of the room, a shape emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, locking onto mine. It moved toward Darren, who was frozen in terror. "Stay back," I shouted, aiming my weapon. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. Then, without a sound, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a chilling silence. I grabbed Darren and pulled him out of the apartment, slamming the door behind us. We ran down the hallway, the whispers fading as we reached the stairwell. When backup arrived, we searched the building, but 3C was empty. The blood in the bathroom was gone, and the apartment looked untouched, as if no one had lived there for years. Darren insisted on filing a report, but his account was met with skepticism. The next day, I returned to the Marwood Arms to follow up, but there was no record of Darren living in 3A, or anywhere else in the building. His number was disconnected, and no one in the complex recognized his name. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The incident was chalked up to stress or a prank gone wrong, but I can't shake the memory of that figure, or the way Darren vanished without a trace. Sometimes, when I drive past the Marwood Arms, I feel the same chill in the air, as if the shadows are watching, waiting for someone else to step inside. It was a stormy night when the call came in, a report of an abandoned convoy of vehicles on Route 217, a stretch of highway infamous for its desolation and eerie reputation. The caller, a trucker passing through, claimed to have seen 3 black SUVs parked on the shoulder, their lights off and no one in sight. Probably just a breakdown, I told myself. but something about the call didn't sit right. Convoys like that didn't usually travel without a purpose, and the fact that no one was present raised a red flag. As the storm raged outside, I grabbed my jacket and headed for my cruiser. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield as I made my way down the winding road. The visibility was poor, and the headlights barely cut through the downpour. Route 217 was notorious for its isolation, with no cell service and miles of unbroken forest on either side. It was the kind of place where you could disappear, and no one would notice. When I finally spotted the vehicles, my unease deepened. The 3 SUVs were parked in a perfect line, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the rain-soaked pavement. I pulled over a safe distance away and radioed dispatch. "This is Officer King. I've located the vehicles on Route 217. No signs of occupants. Requesting backup." The response crackled with static before cutting out completely. I frowned, tapping the radio, but the line was dead. I stepped out of the cruiser, the cold rain soaking through my jacket almost immediately. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder. I approached the first SUV cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the rain. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice muffled by the storm. "This is the police. Is anyone here?" No response. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. Inside, the seats were empty, but the dashboard lights were still on, casting an eerie green glow. A laptop sat open on the passenger seat, its screen displaying a series of garbled text and numbers that made no sense. As I moved to the second SUV, I noticed something strange. The ground around the vehicles was dry, untouched by the rain. It was as if the storm had deliberately avoided them, leaving the asphalt beneath pristine. The second vehicle was identical to the first, empty, with another laptop displaying the same strange data. But this time, there was something else, a briefcase on the back seat, slightly ajar. Inside were papers, maps, and a photograph of a man I didn't recognize. Scribbled across the photo in red ink were the words, "Find him before they do." A chill ran down my spine as I moved to the third SUV. The air around it felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. When I opened the door, the laptop inside was off, but the screen was cracked, as if someone had smashed it in a fit of rage. A faint smell lingered in the air, metallic, like blood. I shone my flashlight around the area, searching for any sign of the occupants. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading away from the vehicles and into the forest. The tracks were deep, suggesting someone had been running, but they stopped abruptly at the tree line. I radioed dispatch again, but the static was worse now, a faint, rhythmic pulse breaking through the noise. It almost sounded like breathing. "Dispatch, this is Officer King. I'm requesting immediate backup on Route 217. Something's not right here." The static crackled again, followed by a voice. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Leave now." My blood ran cold as I scanned the area. The vehicles seemed to loom larger in the rain, their dark shapes blending into the shadows. I was about to return to my cruiser when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the forest. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam landed on a figure standing just inside the tree line. It was tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes reflected the light like a predator's, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Police!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. "Step out where I can see you." The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. Then, without warning, it lunged. I fired a shot, the sound echoing through the night, but the figure was gone. The forest was silent again, the only sound the pounding of the rain. I backed toward my cruiser, my heart racing, but as I turned, I froze. The SUVs were no longer empty. Figures now sat in each one, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel their eyes on me. The headlights of the first SUV flickered on, illuminating the road ahead, and then they started their engines. The roar of the engines drowned out the storm as the SUVs pulled out in unison, disappearing down the road faster than I could follow. I stood there, soaked and shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When backup finally arrived, there was no trace of the vehicles or the figures. The dry ground where they'd been parked was now soaked, indistinguishable from the rest of the road. Even the footprints at the tree line were gone. I filed my report, but the incident was written off as a misunderstanding. No one believed me when I described the figures, the laptops, or the strange photo. And the voice on the radio? They said it was just interference from the storm. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, when the rain pounds against my window, I hear it again. That faint, distorted voice. Leave now. And I wonder if next time, I'll listen.